So now we'd like to move to the next presenter from CK Group, which is Mary Bolt. Welcome, Mary.
Hi,
Thank
Eric.
you.
Thank you.
And we look forward to your presentation.
So, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining today. And it's great to be invited back to speak as part of the Careers Fair. And I hope you found it useful so far with that really insightful talk from Rosh. I'm going to talk this morning about what recruiters specifically look for when we're hiring for regulatory affairs vacancies at varying levels of experience. And then I wanted to discuss some tips on what you can do at all stages of the process. So, application interviews and to make yourself stand out. So firstly, a bit about me. So I am a senior recruitment consultant at CK Group, and I've been with CK for over 7 years now. So I moved into recruitment after a little bit of time in the industry myself. So I worked in GMP manufacturing at Teva after I graduated from a physiology and pharmacology degree. And since I've been at CK, I've worked in regulatory affairs throughout my whole career. And during this time, I've worked with candidates from entry level to senior directors and all types of company, from small biotech startups to your global pharma. So CK were established in 1991, initially more in the chemical industry. But then we've moved into the pharma industry, and we've been working in that now for over 25 years, and have since built presences in biotech and all facets of the drug development world. So we started with an R&D focus, and then our clinical division, which is where regulatory was initially established, was built in 2005. So obviously we've been working in regulatory affairs for nearing 20 years now. And at the current day, so CK is structured with our 4 brands that you can see on screen. So regulatory does often fall under clinical, and we have some positions that do fall under our science team as well. So you may be in contact with consultants from both teams. So I've actually worked across both. I'm based in our life sciences team. And then as a company, so we're proud to work with a diverse range of companies across the drug development world. So these include 18 of the world's top 20 pharma and biotechs, as well as a range of medical device companies, FMCG manufacturers, startups and consultancies. So the whole spectrum of regulatory professionals. So what does the recruiter actually do? I thought it'd be useful, as particularly if you haven't worked with a recruiter before, you might wonder, why we're involved and why a manager might use a recruiter rather than hiring themselves directly. Ultimately, it is quite often to save time. So quite often managers get a lot of CVs, and they don't also have the time to search directly. So it's a time taken to find the right skills and to to shortlist the CVs and find the skills that match what they're looking for. And we're brought in to utilise our expertise in a particular market. Generally recruiters have a specific sector that they recruit in. And our aim is to introduce candidates to clients from the extensive networks and relationships that we've built. And more often than not, it's down to us to act as the initial sort of shortlisting point for CVs and to screen applications, and then provide a shortlist of the most suitable candidates for a particular vacancy to the hiring manager. So some of the initial decision process on who's right or not does come down to us, which makes it very important that you make sure that any recruiter that you're working with has a really clear understanding, not only about what you're looking for and your relevant experience, but anything that might set you apart from other candidates that they're considering as well. So over the next few slides, I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the things I look for, and then what you can think about when you are next applying to a job vacancy. So I thought the best place to start was to discuss for what I look for when I'm recruiting for entry level or graduate level positions. So I wanted to go a bit through the experience of what is needed and what you should be thinking about when you're applying as well. So it is almost always essential, first of all, to have a scientific degree and science background. There are some areas of regulatory where it might not necessarily be essential, things like artwork or operations, but as a general rule, a science degree is the minimum requirement. So it's not only the scientific grounding that you get, obviously the skills you get from a science degree are very broad. So as well as the technical skills and scientific knowledge, recruiters look at the wider skill set that you've gained. So, particularly in regulatory affairs, skills like communication, where you've presented or, taken part in sharing, scientific information with teams or groups of people, attention to detail, accuracy in writing reports. So, things like writing up project reports and, your dissertation, anything like that, there is a lot of technical writing and accuracy in regulatory, so skills like that are very important. And then one thing to note is that nothing can beat hands-on experience. So importantly, if you are still doing your studies, one of the most beneficial things you can do is to get some sort of exposure, to regulatory affairs. So, any graduate placements, internships, or, any placements or volunteering during the holidays in any form of regulatory team or environment, would be really beneficial. And any opportunities like that, I would just say, jump at it and make the most, because they can really be valuable when looking at that career path. Now, these aren't often things that recruiters get. So the best thing to do would be to, network with various contacts. Most companies would recruit for these directly because they know they're going to be very competitive, and they can find a lot of interest. So it is the case of networking with contacts. Things like the events run by Topra can be really helpful with finding people in various companies. Obviously, universities do have really good networks with companies that run graduate schemes. So they may well sort of post and make known various opportunities internally, but also keep an eye out on company websites and anything specific, any particular companies you're interested in, and they're quite likely to advertise any internships or things like that directly. So it's always a good place to start. And then, as well as getting that initial hands-on experience and introduction into the role, undertaking a placement like this shows that you're committed to following a career path. You've really taken the time to put your own time into getting an exposure to what it's going to be, and that you're fully prepared for what the job will involve when you do start a full-time career. And now, although it's not necessarily essential, if you're struggling to get any sort of hands-on experience, there are other alternatives. Some universities do offer postgraduate qualifications. I know there are, an MSc in regulatory affairs and various things available, which, although it's not a substitute for hands-on experience, it can help to show, your commitment to following the career path and your interest and passion in following a career in regulatory affairs. And one important thing to remember is when entry levels come up, entry level roles come up, they are very competitive. So you really do need to start thinking about how you're going to show particular interest in regulatory affairs, proactive work experience, volunteering, anything that you've done to gain an insight and to be sure that that career is what you want to do. It's so competitive, and if obviously at graduate level everyone has a similar level of experience, so it's really important to show that you're really passionate about regulatory and you want to follow that career path, and that can really set the difference between your CV moving forward against other candidates that haven't demonstrated that. And then again, if you're still struggling to get success, the other option would be, to consider other opportunities in industry, where you can get, relevant skills, or, work in a role that has some links to the regulatory team. You will be getting industry exposure and obviously building up transferable skills, and then you can work at moving over once you've established some industry experience. And the one thing I would say about this, if you're going to take this approach, so don't just apply for all graduate level roles that are advertised. Be selective, really think about the roles that have, transferable skills to a regulatory career. I'll come onto this in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But don't just apply to every graduate role. Obviously, in a situation like myself, I might be advertising quite a lot of different roles at the same time. And, if a candidate comes through applying for absolutely everything, it does raise questions about how well they thought through, what they want to do and the motivations and why they're actually applying to the roles that they're applying for. So it's really important to make sure you're looking at roles that have got the skills to take you, on that career path. So as I just touched on, it can be possible to start a career in regulatory after spending some time in industry. As long as you build up the right skills and, in other roles, and then still, continue to show a passion and career development towards a regulatory career. So if you're already working in the pharma or biotech industry, so roles that where you're regularly working with the regulatory team and, being able to get an understanding of what they do, particularly if you can get any involvement in roles where, you have involvement with submissions. So, sometimes roles like formulation, have some involvement with CMC documentation, clinical research roles, things like study startup can have some input into CTAs. And any exposure you can get towards those submissions can be beneficial and help you move towards regulatory affairs. And even just interacting and working with the regulatory team on a regular basis can give you a good insight. So it's important to think about how you'd explain why you want to move into regulatory over the role that you're currently in industry or other areas. So again, explaining your motivations is really important. And it's important to think, how you describe your understanding of the day-to-day purpose and responsibilities of the regulatory teams, what you've seen so far, what interactions you've had with the regulatory team. You may also get, a lot of companies offer opportunities to do secondments in different divisions. So if you can, get a secondment into a regulatory team, even if it's for a few months or 6 months, again, that'd be a brilliant opportunity to help with that transition over. And again, when you're looking at moving from an industry role, again, it's very important to really, pull out any experience that you have previously done. If you did previously do any sort of placements or volunteering in regulatory or any secondments, really think about the skills you built from them when you're applying to, to a regulatory role. It's really important, to focus on discussing those transferable skills that you've built, how they can help you move into that regulatory career. And again, just make sure, at any point that you're researching role in the company so that you can be specific about your motivations. And again, keep your applications specific to roles that are relevant to your transferable skills. So as I mentioned, if you are working the formulation role and inputting into CMC documentation, it'd be really valuable to focus on those type of positions. And, just make sure you're being as close to your skill set as you can. So if you are looking at a more senior level and you've already established in regulatory affairs, it's important to think about, why you're looking to move when you start to apply for a new role. So it's going to be a time when you're possibly looking at more experience or a progression step. So when I look at a senior level role, I'm really looking at a specific skill set that the hiring manager has given me and asked me to find for their team. So it's important at this stage. Obviously, the candidates are going to have a very similar level of experience, and again, it's thinking about those finer details. Specific experience that you have. Whether it's similar products, a particular therapeutic area, a particular drug, submission strategy, a region of submissions. It's important to think about those really finer details where you might just have an edge or stand out from other candidates. It's really important because obviously, at a senior level, all the candidates that apply are going to have some level of regulatory experience. So you need to think about, how relevant you are to the job description and what can make you stand out. It's also key for me, as I touched on it, to understand why you want to move at that particular point. Again, managers generally ask me to give them a good understanding of, what your motivations are, why you're wanting to move and what you want to gain from this role. So, is there specific experience that you're looking for? Is there anything you can gain from joining the client? Certain progression steps that you want, or perhaps there's something really interesting to you or something that you're really passionate about the company's product and research, or their culture that is really interesting to you. And again, it's so important to make sure you've researched the company at any level of application. At some point, whether it's, talking to me or, when you have an initial interview, you need to be able to confidently explain, why you're interested in them, what made you want to apply, and, what you're going to gain that's different from your current position. And, they also generally look for demonstrating company values, particularly if you're looking at roles in, developing teams, perhaps with smaller biotechs where they're growing. Finding the right fit for them, is very critical for the team to work well. So, they generally look for, a shared passion with the company values, a shared passion about the research that they're doing. So, have a think about those areas that you can really elaborate on when it comes to applying in interviews. And obviously, when it comes to looking at leadership level roles, other skills and soft skills that you've built so far in your career become a lot more important. So, things like communication, training, supervising staff all become very important in management and become a very important factor in the interview and the application process. So, I'm myself and the manager will generally look for evidence of how you've built these. Some roles it is essential that you've had management experience before. And if you are wanting to move towards this, try and find extra responsibility, play a role in training staff, developing more junior team members, get opportunities to deputise for more senior members of the team if they're not around, and really look at building those skills and more levels of responsibility. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to go through some tips on how to go about your applications and preparing for interviews so that you can really give yourself the best chance of thinking about how you can stand out from the other applicants and hopefully succeeding the next time that you are applying for a new role. So firstly, there are a few things to think about before you even make that first application. I would always say make sure you have a full understanding of the job description. You need to be confident that you're well matched, and can you display evidence of relevant experience? Whether that is with similar products, therapeutic areas, submission strategies. Do you honestly fit the specification that they're looking for? I mean, obviously, you always want to have some scope for development, but as well as that, you need to have a good amount of experience that is matching as well. Make sure that you research the company. You need to be sure at this point before you put an application in that it's an organization you're passionate about and you want to be part of. I mean, by all means, you don't need to be able to reel off every single fact that is available in the public domain about a company, but it really help your application stand out if it's obvious that you've thought through and you've been able to relate your experience and what they do to your application, your CV. Showing a shared interest and passion in their research and science, and obviously the company values are always important. And further down the line, the more you prepare, you're going to be asked at some point to explain, even if it's an interview, to explain why you want to join them. So putting in the preparation now can really help not only your application, but being in a good place for those next stages as well. So it's vitally important to get your CV right. Although it's often, it will come to me in the first instance, it is often your first impression to the manager as well, and to really make a positive impact on them. So once you've reviewed the company and the job description, really think about tailoring your CV. Not only just highlighting key skills, therapeutic, drug product experience, as well as soft skills and anything that can make you stand out. I really can't stress enough how important it is to make sure that whenever you're applying to a role, to make your CV as specific as possible to each position. Regulatory, you can have a lot of similar types of job titles. You could get senior regulatory associate. If you put that into Indeed, you could come up with 100 jobs. But in the finer detail, they're generally looking for a lot of different types of skills, different types of submissions, different regions. So really focus on what that particular position is looking for, and highlighting anything relevant that you have to that on your CV. It's really important to show how closely you fit with the specification. So buzzwords are important. So use key technical words that are in the job description. So obviously in regulatory, there are a lot of acronyms that are used, and quite often, if a recruiter or a HR person is the first person to review your CV, they obviously, we don't always have the same technical experience as the hiring manager. And, although we get a good overview of what the manager wants, sometimes if you use an alternative sort of term or an alternative acronym for something that we might not be aware of, it doesn't always match up with the information that we've been given. So, if there are a lot of technical words on the job description, if you're going to talk about your experience with that, make sure you use what has been put on the job description. Or if you're using an acronym, use the shortened version and the longer version that's on the job description, so that they obviously match up when your CV is being reviewed. There is a lot of specific terminology in regulatory, so it's really important to be clear about exactly what you have experience with, making it obvious, what you have experience with that is relevant to that job application. Obviously, the layout of the CV is important. It's got to be clear, easy on the eye, and the best advice I can give is bullet points and headings. And also, I won't go into more detail, but obviously, if you did want any specific advice on CVs and CV format, then please feel free to reach out to me. And then at the end of this section, I've got a little slide at the end where there's some links to different things on our website about CV writing, and a 30-second CV test where you can check if you've covered everything that you need. So you may also be asked to provide a cover letter. Now, I would say only do this if you're specifically asked to do that. Most of the clients that I work with just ask for a CV. But there are instances, it could be, particularly senior roles where there's a really specialist focus, or, they want to have, a better insight into your technical expertise in a particular area. Or it could even be more with junior level roles. If there is a graduate position that's really competitive, managers might want to see a cover letter from the candidate to really get a feel for, your motivations and your interest in the role. So if you are asked to do one, follow similar advice to writing your CV. Keep it extremely relevant to the company and the job description. I mean, a cover letter is a great opportunity, to not just focus on your skills, but, to really explain why you're interested in the opportunity and why you're applying. You can do that a bit more so than you can do on your CV. So, you know, keep it to the point. You know, a few paragraphs is perfect. You know, don't go over a side of A4, but really think about, you know, explaining your interest, and then structure it like a formal letter, and make sure that you spell check. Again, that is something that I can only stress for CVs and cover letters. Obviously, with you know, regulatory roles, that there is a high attention to detail, you know, in all aspects of regulatory affairs. So if a manager sees an application or a CV that comes through and you know, it's covered in, you know, spelling errors, and it hasn't obviously been spell checked, then, you know, it can raise questions to the level of attention to detail. So, you know, that's always something that, you know, I look through CVs for as well. And then here is a slide. Obviously, you've shared these after. I know Eric said he passed the slides on. So there's a few links to things on our website and the 30-second CV check. So then, after making sure that your application is as strong as possible, and hopefully you'll be invited into an interview and have an opportunity to speak directly with the manager. So obviously at this point, you know, I'm not so much involved in the process apart from managing, and obviously, you know, I'll try and support you as much as I can through the interview process and what you need to prepare for. So again, it is so important to prepare for any stage of interview, and, you know, prepare again. You know, it could be a few weeks after you've had your application submitted. So, you know, don't be complacent. You know, always make sure you take time to prepare for an interview. The points that I'll talk about, you know, they're going to be generally relevant to all types of interviews. You know, they'll make up a key part of the discussion, and they are important to get right. Obviously, you know, there are some different types of interviews, you know, with specific tasks, so there could be presentations or written tests. So at that point, you know, the recruiter that you're working with, you know, should give you all the information from the client of what they're expecting, and, you know, give you an overview of how to prepare. So as I mentioned before, you know, it's so important to research the company. It can be one of the biggest mistakes that candidates make. Is quite often, you know, the very first question you can be asked is, you know, okay, so what made you apply, or, you know, why are you interested in this role, or why are you interested in the company? So, you know, if you can't answer that, you know, in the first few minutes of the interview, it can really, you know, ruin your chances almost from that very beginning. And, you know, it's so important to be able to confidently talk about, you know, why you want to work for them, and, you know, what made you apply. So thoroughly research the company website, but by all means, that's not the only resource out there. You know, we always suggest looking at the LinkedIn profile of the interviewer. You know, have a look at their background. Is there anything similar with, you know, your experience so far? You know, obviously a lot of companies now have various social media accounts and LinkedIn pages. You know, there might be online company brochures, and obviously any latest news articles as well. You know, recent drug releases and anything that's recently in the news, you know, can be really, you know, useful to know. And it might sound strange, but always review your CV before the interview, because it's so important to remind yourself of key experience that is relevant, you know, to that particular role. So I always actually suggest going through the CV and the job description side by side, and, you know, possibly highlighting, you know, anything that matches, and, you know, the most relevant experience that you have to talk about. It is also important, though, to think about, you know, the experience that you have to gain and where you can develop in the role, because quite often, you know, you might be asked to discuss your strengths, but you could also be asked, you know, to explain what you think your weaknesses are and where you need to develop in the role. So it's always important to think about that as well. You may also get asked to talk, you know, about your impression of what the job profile is, and, you know, your understanding of what the day-to-day responsibilities will be from what you've read. So it's really important to make sure you're familiar with the job description, and you know, you have an understanding of what you're going to be expected to do. And it can also help to write out, you know, a SWOT analysis beforehand, to be able to discuss your strengths and weaknesses in detail as well. So it is important to prepare for competency-based questions. So these are questions using the STAR technique, where you're asked to describe a particular situation you've seen. So these are important. You know, they're generally seen to see how you would handle or react in a particular situation, and can be used at all levels of interview and all interview stages. And obviously, you know, they can be particularly important in more senior level positions, you know, particularly when looking at skills in sort of leading projects, or managing people, and, you know, how you would handle challenges or problems. But they can also be used, you know, at all levels, to look at how you'd interact, you know, how you work in a team, and all sorts of things like that. So, you know, they're always vital to prepare for. And they are one of the types of questions that, you know, you can really make a difference by preparing for them and thinking about, you know, the examples you'll use, and the structure of how you'd answer the questions beforehand, and just writing them down. It's always important as well, you know, it can be really hard with nerves, but try to come across as yourself, and show your personality. You know, it's important at the interview stage that the manager and team get to know you, and, you know, how you're going to fit and interact with everyone. So, obviously, you are under pressure in an interview situation, but really take time to think about how you can get your personality across. It might just be a case of, discussing your motivations and interests outside of work, but, think of ways of how you can show your personality and, how you fit in with the team as well. Be on time, and dress for success, always two important things. So it's always really important to give that best impression when you go to your interview with the new manager. So these are mistakes that do quite often get made. Prepare well in advance if you're traveling. Make sure that you review the route. Leave plenty of time. Particularly, allow time for problems. So if you're on a train, obviously leave time for cancelled trains. Or if you're on if you're driving, make sure you leave time in case of any problems, or road closures, or blockages on the motorway, anything like that. It's often a problem that we see, and it's hard to prepare for, but if you make sure that you leave plenty of time and that you're aware of it, then quite often you can work around any problems. We always say to be at site 10 minutes before an interview starts, but obviously it's often a lot more beneficial to get to the local area quite a bit earlier. The last thing you want is to turn up all flustered and last minute to an interview, and then you're not going to be in the best mind frame or place to perform well. And obviously prepare what you're going to wear in advance, even for a video call, dress as if you're attending a face-to-face meeting. So then, having been the main format for interviewing for the past 12 months, video interviews are being used more than ever. And if you're actively applying at the moment, it's very likely you're going to be asked to interview over video at least one stage of the process. So again, make sure you prepare your environment and your technology in advance. Make sure that the background behind you is neutral, tidy. Make sure all of your technology works, so camera, speakers, microphone, as well as any apps or links that you might have to use. Always check a video link beforehand. The worst thing is trying at the last minute and realize the link doesn't work for some reason. Again, treat it like a face-to-face interview, dress as you would if you're going to site, and just remember it's always vitally important that you make the right first impression. And one thing to note, it can just be that little bit harder to build rapport without, the face-to-face interaction and being in, the interview environment. So, make sure you actively listen to what interviews are asking. Try not to get distracted. It can be very easy if you're at home, particularly if there are other people or pets and things around. Make sure that you're somewhere quiet and where you won't be interrupted. And make sure your phone's out of the way and on silent, or and any notifications are turned off that might pop up on your computer. And again, don't be afraid to ask questions and engage and be active in the conversation. And then finally, make sure if things do go wrong, managers understand that technical issues happen no matter how prepared you are. So if a connection does go down halfway through a meeting and there's no way you can get back in, then just reach out either directly to the recruiter, or often the managers will give you a direct number to phone them in any problems. And there's almost always a way to work around it and find a solution to reschedule or rejoin the call. And this slide is, again, it's some links to our website for different advice on preparing for interviews, and the overview of the SWOT analysis, just in case that'd be helpful for interview preparation. So to quickly summarise the main points, so recruiters are looking for a balance of technical experience, your personality fit for the client's team, soft skills, and your motivation. So it's important to think about all of these. How will you match with the client and what they're looking for, and how you can demonstrate that you thought about these, to really make yourself stand out in the process. Always be able to discuss your motivations, either whether they're starting or developing your regulatory career, or whether the motivations for applying for a particular role or a company. Putting the time to do that research, really think about why you want to be part of the business and what you can bring to them can really set you apart as well. And every stage of the process is equally important. Skills are being assessed at both application and interview stage. Obviously a recruiter will assess your initial application, so we do have some of that initial decision making, but then we are there to support you and help you through the rest of the process as well. So ask us whenever you need advice. And again, to reiterate, it's so important to prepare and research at every stage to stand out from the crowd. And that is everything. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. We've had requests for your presentation already. So we have time for a few questions. Let me go through them. So first question is there a big demand for regulatory affairs professionals in the UK?
Yes, I'd certainly say so. It's always been an area that we find quite busy. I mean, obviously, there are lots of different businesses that, regulatory professionals are required in. So, whether that's pharma companies, there's quite a big amount of consultancies out there where, there's large numbers of professionals working in that area. And obviously, we're seeing quite a big rise in, roles such as IVDs, particularly with things like COVID testing, and, biotech companies are really, sort of growing and expanding. So yeah, we always see quite a big demand for regulatory professionals.
Okay. There's a question about volunteering or internship. How can I find a company where I could volunteer for some weeks or for an internship? Who do you connect with to do that? Have you got any specific suggestions or advice?
Oh, that is a good question. I mean, the best place to start would be, think about, particular companies that you'd maybe be really interested to work with, or, companies that are local to you that you'd be able to get to quite easily, to work for, that amount of time. I think the best port of call would obviously be start with their website and their careers pages, because as I mentioned, quite often, if there are any opportunities like that, companies will advertise them directly. There's generally HR or recruitment teams. A lot of companies even have, specific graduate recruitment people to reach out to. So that would be my first point of call, really, and see if they have anything available.
Okay. So what is potentially guaranteed to put you off looking at a CV or shortlisting it? Are there any do's or don'ts for entry-level CVs?
Okay. So again, the biggest problem with graduate level CVs is when they're not specific to a particular role. And I know it can be so difficult at graduate level because you want to get industry experience. You want to get into work as soon as possible. But obviously, if we get a CV, obviously we can be advertising for quite a number of roles at the same time. They might not always be advertised as graduate, because sometimes companies can look at different level of people. But if we do get a CV applying for lots and lots of jobs, and it's just the same CV every time, then it really does just it raises questions about how much you thought through the process. Do you have a particular motivation to actually move into that career, or are you just applying for anything that's out there, and you're not really sure about what the role actually is. So that is probably the biggest problem, because it's really hard to to shortlist from that point, because you just don't know what the motivations are. And obviously if you come across a CV then that has got real clear passion about regulatory, attending events at TOPRA, trying to get experience, they've shown a really thought through process of writing their CV and their motivations and why they want to be part of that, then obviously the CV that has got the clear motivations on will be shortlisted every time. And then the other main thing is obviously, spelling mistakes and errors. It's so important, to make sure that you spell check and that you really make sure there's no mistakes on that. Because again, you're going to be expected to be paying attention to detail and, being accurate. And if your CV is full of spelling mistakes, then that's usually something that a manager would say no to straight away.
Yeah, I suppose you wouldn't want to also rely on the word spell check. You, you,
No.
you, you do a double check in yourself as well, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Um, so the next question is, are there many complications when transitioning from medical device to pharmaceutical regulatory field?
It can be tricky. Obviously, they are quite distinct sets of regulations and different processes of registering the products. So it can be quite hard to transfer. We don't often get, say a pharmaceutical regulatory role where they would consider people that have only had experience with diagnostics or devices before, just purely because of the differences in the, the submission strategy and pathways. I guess some of the easiest ways to do it is to perhaps look at roles where you perhaps got a combination product, where you might be using a combination of a device with a drug, or perhaps trying to look at a company where they might have both types of products in their portfolio, and the regulatory team might work across both. So although you can lean on your current experience, you might be able to gain exposure into the other projects that they have, and work towards building up experience in the other area.
Okay. Are there any specific roles in regulatory affairs that a registered nurse with regulatory affairs training can do? If yes, what would be the first actionable item a registered nurse should make towards education?
Okay, that's not something I've come across too often. I mean, if the nurse has got regulatory experience, I mean, I'd possibly imagine it might be that the experience might be more along the clinical trial side, depending on if they've done research or not. I mean, I suppose it depends on the level of regulatory experience so far that they've had. I mean, if it's just a case, if they've not had actual industry experience, it very much would be a case of, looking at entry level roles and, showing your motivations to start in regulatory. If you have got some regulatory experience, it would depend on the extent of that and, what that experience is actually in. So it's quite hard to answer without knowing more. But, obviously nursing is a brilliant science background, and I have seen, research nurses in clinical trials move into regulatory affairs. So, it's certainly possible.
Okay. Right. So we do two more questions. How many pages should a CV be? I was always told 2 pages maximum. Is that still the case, or?
Good question. No, it's difficult. I mean, I think in some industries that works quite well. I think in anything scientific, it's certainly not worthwhile cutting down your CV just to make it stick to 2 pages and leaving half of your experience out. It is much more important to be able to demonstrate, the experience that you've done and, how your experience is relevant to the role. And obviously, as you get to more senior levels, it can be almost impossible to get your CV down to 2 pages and actually include everything that you need. So, I mean, obviously, you don't want one that's like 15 pages long, but, I wouldn't worry about it being 2 pages. We quite often see CVs that are 3, 4, 5 pages long, depending on the level of experience. And that's fine. I mean, the managers would more, they'd prefer to see, as much experience as they can at the initial stages and be able to make a good decision on, whether you're suitable, rather than having lots of questions and not, perhaps not being sure whether to interview you or not because they just don't know there's enough detail.
Yeah, yeah, okay. And then the final question, how can we manage automatic filters used by generally global companies which receives huge numbers of applications, but sometimes 2 to 3 hours after applying, auto rejection comes, even if you have a high match with the job content and requirements?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the beginning of that question.
So they're wondering how you can kind of bypass or manage automatic filters when, generally used
Okay.
by global companies, when you're applying, and when you then get maybe rejected, even if you have a high match with that particular
Yeah, of
job.
course. That is a tricky one. I mean, that is, I guess it's one area where a recruitment consultant can be really valuable because quite often we have, an actual sort of verbal line of communication with the client. So, although I know a lot of the times, we might be applying for a role and obviously it might also be advertised on the company's website directly. Obviously at the initial application stage, it doesn't make a lot of difference. But, one thing that we can do is manage that process. So, if we get feedback, we can ask the client, particularly why, and we can try and get a bit more insight for you. And obviously, at the beginning as well, we can really, tell you if the role is going to be right. Quite often we've had in-depth conversations with the manager before we start recruiting. We know exactly what they're going to need, what they're looking for, so we can tell you, from the minute we speak to you, if we think you've got a good chance of being considered or not. And obviously we can manage that process and help you through. And obviously, if there is any rejection, then we can get as much feedback as possible. The only other way, again, I suppose just being careful to make sure that your CV and everything is as close to the job description as you can, making sure that you've highlighted all of your relevant experience and, really showing motivations for that particular role and company. I think generally, automatic rejections tend to come if, sometimes with big companies, it could almost be like an automatic keyword finder that they're using. So again, this comes down to what I mentioned, making sure that you use keywords and acronyms that are on the job description. Make sure that you're clear about what you have experience with, because sometimes it could just be like an algorithm that's picking out CVs that are right.
Okay, well, that was very insightful. Thank you very much. I know there's a couple of questions left, but we've kind of run out of time. We're due a break now. But don't worry, they will be answered. We're making a note of all the questions asked, so that will be fine. So yes, so we're going for a break now. It's a little bit later than advertised, but that's okay. But if you can be back at 1:45, then we'll resume with the LRC. So thank you very much for now. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Mary, for your
No
presentation. It was
problem
great.
at all.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day, everyone.
Thank you, Mary.
No problem.